Everyone. We are going to be learning about bumblebees tonight from Amy Dolan. Amy is a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, which you can see here on the screen. I'm really excited to learn about this project because we are looking forward to incorporating some of this work into our education programming this year. You're also going to hear about some ways for you yourself to get involved. So with that, this lecture is part of our annual winter lecture series that highlights topics of interest and ongoing research in our national conservation areas. So thank you, Amy, for being with us tonight, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Annie. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Thanks for letting me join you this evening. Like Annie said, my name is Amy Dolan. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, and my role as for the Xerces Society, like Annie said, is I'm the coordinator of the Mountain States Bumblebee Atlas. I moved to Grand Junction in June of last year to launch this project. And I'm really excited about the project. I'm really excited to speak to you tonight about one of my favorite animals, bumblebees. And from what people put in the chat with that question of what word pops in your mind, it seems like a lot of you that are there agree with me that these are just really amazing, adorable animals that are fun to learn about, and then important for us to know about conservation concerns and what we can do to help them. Okay. If you are not familiar with the Xerces Society, we are a science-based nonprofit organization, and all of our work is to protect invertebrates and the habitats that support them. So all of those creatures, those animals that don't have a backbone, all of that falls into our area. But we do have certain projects that we focus on. We have a bumblebee team and bumblebee atlas team. We have monarch monitoring teams. We have a fireflies team. We have a freshwater mussel team. And then we just have a bunch of staff members all over the country that are working on education, outreach, habitat restoration, advocacy, all sorts of different activities that are all about protecting invertebrates and the habitats that support them. Tonight, as you could tell, I'm going to be speaking about bumblebees. And so just like four main topics, just so you know where we're headed. I want to talk about just the diversity of bumblebees and their importance. I want to share with you a little bit about their biology and life cycle, because that's an important piece of understanding them. And some really awesome adaptations, things that make them really unique animals. I want to talk about concerns with conservation and then what we can all do to help, including I'm telling you a little bit about the Bumblebee Atlas. So I used to be, well, for most of my career, I was a middle school and high school science teacher, so I like to start big picture with like where in the whole realm of animals do bumblebees fit in. So if you think back to what you learned about levels of classification, levels of taxonomy, we have domain, then kingdom, phylum, class, order. So these animals are arthropods, they're insects, and bees fall within the order Hymenoptera. They're in the same group as wasps, ants, and sawflies. There are 6 different families of bees found in North America. There are 7 families of bees. Every bee is classified into one of 7 families across the whole world, and 6 of those families can be found in North America. Within those 6 families, there are at least 20,000 species worldwide, and almost 4,000 can be found in North America. Probably more. We know that there are undiscovered species of bees, and we know that there are some that have been discovered but just have not gone through the scientific process of being described. I was working with some of the folks at the Museum of Natural History at the University in Boulder over the summer, and they were really excited because as of last year, we have reached the 1,000 mark of numbers of species of bees in Colorado, which is pretty high diversity for a state to have. Our diversity of landscapes here in Colorado makes this just a really fun place to learn about bees and bee diversity. So if we zoom into bumblebees, all bumblebees on all of Earth, across the world, they're all part of the same genus. So if you hear Bombus, that's the genus of every bumblebee. There are at least 250 species worldwide. Some people say 260, but there's a lot of disagreement about if species should be split apart or put together. So depending on which taxonomist you talk to, that will determine how many species there are. In North America, we have at least 50 species, or around 50 species, again, depending on who you talk to. And then at least 24 are known in Colorado. Unlike other native bees, bumblebees do best and are most diverse in cooler environments, more temperate environments, and montane environments. So these places where there's mountains and just the western US is a really great place for learning about bumblebees and looking for bumblebees. The other really special thing about Colorado is this is the place where eastern bumblebee species and western bumblebee species kind of meet and overlap. So if you travel and look for bumblebees in eastern Colorado, you're going to find things that are mostly found in the eastern US. And then once you get into the mountains, you get more into some of those western species. And then there's some species that are just known all across the US. And I just want to start a little bit with what bumblebees are not, because pretty much any time I start to tell somebody that, oh, I'm a biologist, I'm a conservation biologist, and I study native bees and I study bumblebees, people like to tell me their honeybee stories, and that is not what I study. Bumblebees and honeybees are different. They're in the same family. They're both apids. They're both excellent pollinators. And they both live in colonies. They have queen and workers, and they both carry their pollen in the same way, in a little ball of pollen mixed with nectar that you can see really well in that honeybee picture there. So both bumblebees and honeybees carry their pollen that way. But bumblebees are native to North America, and honeybees are not. Honeybees were imported to North America from Europe with the colonists. All honeybees across the US, they're all the same species. There's different breeds, but they're all the same species. Honeybees, even though sometimes they can swarm and possibly establish a nest outside of a managed hive, because of pathogens and temperature and just lots of different things, it's really rare for honeybee hives to survive outside of managed hives. So if you see honeybees, they most likely came from somebody's hive, and bumblebees are just wild. Honeybees are hugely important in the United States' agriculture practices because of the way we do really big agriculture. We need huge numbers of bees in short amounts of time for pollinating our agriculture. And bumblebees are just excellent pollinators of crops, native plants, whatever they come across. Bumblebees have, we have evidence that 25% of North American bumblebee species are in decline. And honeybees, even though you hear like there are a lot of health issues, honeybee hives have, you've heard of colony collapse disorder and lots of different things. The species itself is not endangered. There's a lot of hives in the US in 2023, 2.7 million hives. So the species is not endangered. That doesn't mean everything's great with them, but they're not endangered. I've heard other bee taxonomists talk about honeybees and native bees, comparing them kind of to birds. So if you are an ornithologist or a birder, you like to go and look for birds in the wild. That's like bumblebees and all the other native bees is like going out and seeing the birds in their native habitat. Honeybees, because they're managed, they're kind of like the chickens of the bee world. Honeybees are raised for agriculture. They're agricultural tools. They're like the chickens of the bee world. So if I wanted to study wild bees, I wouldn't be studying my chickens. I would go out and study the other native bees. The other thing that a lot of people confuse with bumblebees, and actually they confuse them with honeybees as well, are yellow jackets. So people tell me their horror stories of getting stung, and most of the time, almost all of the time, it's not bumblebees that are stinging them. Most likely it's yellow jackets, because both both bees, like all different species of bees, and yellow jackets have that black and white or that black and yellow patterning. Um, they they both can buzz. They both can sting. But the difference is that bees, all native bees are hairy. They have pollen carrying structures. They typically are not aggressive and they are solely vegetarian. They only eat and collect pollen and nectar. Well, yellow jackets, those wasps, they can be aggressive, and that's because they're scavengers and carnivores. They collect meat for their larvae. And so they will be happy to dig through garbage, dig through picnics, barbecue, whatever they can find. They'll take that back to their larvae, where that doesn't interest bees. They are solely vegetarians. And then when you see those paper nests in trees or on structures, those are yellow jacket nests. Most native bees, including bumblebees, build their nest underground or in existing cavities. So just to I like to start off with that because a lot of people get those mixed up in their heads. So we're not talking about yellow jackets, we're not talking about honeybees. So again, still a little bit of big picture, like why do we care about bees? Why are we even talking about bumblebees? And the answer is probably pretty obvious, is they're like really key pollinators. And pollination is just that process of plants reproducing. It's the process of getting the pollen, which is the male reproductive cells, from the anthers into the pistil down to the ovary, in order for it to meet the female reproductive structures and so seeds can be produced. So pollination, that can happen by wind. Plants can self-pollinate, but a lot of animals help with pollination. And there's a huge diversity of animals that can do that, including birds and bats. But most pollinators are insects. And of those insects, a lot of them are bees. And this is important because if you think about plant reproduction, why do we care about plant reproduction? One of the big reasons we care about plants is because of our food. So 1 in 3 bites of food we eat is courtesy of insect pollination. We wouldn't be without food if all bees went extinct, but we would be without some of our like really, really yummy, delicious foods, like a lot of the fruits and berries and nuts and things that we like to have. So they're not required for all food, but 1 in 3 bites of food we eat is courtesy of insect pollination. And then 90% of the world's wild plants depend on pollinators to reproduce. So that's kind of big picture, like that's like our world would be really different without having those insect pollinators. And well, the first thing that we probably think of with pollination is food supplies. It's also like they're really vital in ecosystems. A lot of small mammals and birds rely on seeds and fruits and nuts in their diet, and those wouldn't happen if plants weren't reproducing, often with the help of a pollinator. Plants provide habitat for other things. If you look here, there's a little baby deer sleeping there. And so like that habitat is built by plants, and the plants often rely on insect pollinators. And sometimes the pollinators themselves, like this baby butterfly, are the food. And so pollinators just in lots of different ways provide food and habitat for wildlife. They also have think about the cultural and aesthetic value. If you like to garden, if you like pumpkins in the fall, and I just think so much about wildflower hikes, like hiking in the mountain and seeing a whole hillside or a whole meadow that's just filled with flowers. That would just be really different if we didn't have our insect pollinators. Because of this, pollinators are considered what are called keystone species, which means without them, every ecosystem on Earth would be drastically different if they didn't exist. So of all of the different animal and insect pollinators, bees are the most efficient, and that is because of this word intentionally. They are the only ones that are intentionally collecting and transporting pollen like solely. Adult bees eat pollen for protein and other nutrients, and they drink nectar for carbohydrates. And then they are intentionally collecting it because the only food for bee larvae is pollen and nectar, again, for protein and carbohydrates. Every species of bee has some sort of pollen carrying structure. So pollen sticks to them. They have branched hairs to help hold the pollen. There's a little electrostatic charge that helps the pollen stick to them. And then they groom themselves to carry it back. But even when they groom it, when this bumblebee packs all that pollen onto her back leg to carry it back to the nest, there's going to be little grains of pollen that are still stuck to those hairs because she spends her whole time in the flowers and the pollen is just going to be moving back and forth between the flowers. So some bees, like bumblebees and honeybees, carry that pollen on their back leg in a little ball like that. Other bees, like leaf-cutting bees and mason bees, carry the pollen on the underside of their abdomen. Other bees, like they're called longhorn bees or digger bees or sunflower bees, they have specialized hairs on the sides of their legs. I like to call them the bees that look like they're wearing chaps. And they just can carry a large amount of pollen on their legs because of those hairs. And then there's actually some tricky bees that are not the best pollinators. This little bee is almost looks like a wasp. She's essentially hairless because she swallows the pollen nectar and then regurgitates it back at the nest. But every bee is collecting and transporting pollen on purpose, where a lot, like most other insects, are visiting the flower and they're feeding on the pollen, they're drinking the nectar, but they're not intentionally collecting and transporting it. The other thing that is beneficial for plants is that bees typically exhibit a behavior called flower constancy, which means on any particular foraging flight, they stick to one type of flower. For the bees, that's beneficial because then they don't have to learn how to extract pollen and nectar from different types of flowers. They just like stick to the same type of flower and they can gather it quickly. And that's good for the plants because then that bee is carrying, mostly just carrying one type of pollen to help those flowers to be able to reproduce. So thinking about like bees are important, they're fun to learn about, but like thinking about bumblebees, why am I focusing my job, my role on bumblebees, and why is our atlas focused just on bumblebees? And one reason is that they're really charismatic and they're well known. So if you want to teach people about bees or initiate, like we are doing, a really wide scale community science projects, bumblebees are a really good starter bee for people. They're easy to recognize, they're big and they're fluffy, they're adorable, you can get people to love them, and they're easy for people to identify. Some other bees are really small. You need to have a bee specimen under a microscope to be able to identify it to species, and that's not true of bumblebees. So they're a really good place to start especially when you're gathering community scientists to learn about and help with this conservation project. Bumblebees have unique and interesting adaptations, which make them not only fun to learn about, but make them unique in their role as pollinators. They're active from early spring until late fall because of the way that their colony cycle works. So that makes them easy to study. You can look for and document bumblebees from early spring until late fall. That's also, I think, why they're so well known. But that also, if you think about it, makes them more vulnerable. If they're trying to keep their colony alive from spring until late fall, anytime there's a disturbance, that colony is vulnerable. So it helps us to know them better, but it also kind of puts them at risk because they have to survive that whole time and find food for that whole time for the colony to survive. And then the last reason that we're focusing on bumblebees is we have evidence that we know populations of bumblebees are known to be in decline. Their populations are declining and their ranges are declining. So like I said, I just want to talk about some really interesting biology and adaptations, things that make bumblebees unique in the bee world. So they are similar to honeybees. They are eusocial. So a eusocial colony is where you have that one queen, multiple generations of female workers that are the daughters of the queen and sisters to each other, and that is the worker force of the colony. That is, even though that's the bee life cycle that most people are familiar with, that's really the exception to the rule in the bee world. Most bees are actually solitary. They don't have a colony, they don't work eusocially. It's just one female bee building a nest and provisioning her cells. So they are eusocial, similar to honeybees. A lot of people don't realize that just like butterflies, bumblebees go through a complete metamorphosis. So the queen will lay an egg, that egg will hatch, and there'll be a kind of ugly worm-like larva. That is the feeding stage. And it spends most of the bees will spend a lot of time as a larva. It will then go through the pupa, like that, similar to a cocoon stage, where it'll go through a metamorphosis and emerge as an adult, and then become, an adult member of that colony. Bumblebees tend to nest in abandoned cavities. A lot of times, abandoned rodent burrows or things like that. They won't dig their own holes, but they will find a cavity that's abandoned and use that. It's often underground. There's a lot that we don't know about nests. They're pretty hard to find, but nests have also been known to, like we've found nests in bunch grasses above ground, sometimes in the inside of structures, like if they find a way in. They like the insulation of houses and garages. There was someone last summer that sent me a message saying that underneath her kayak in her garage, she found a bumblebee nest. And so they're just going to find any cavity that feels safe to build that nest. And if you look at this picture here, if you're used to seeing honeybee nests that are so like beautiful and organized, bumblebee nests are kind of a mess. Like they seem a little haphazard. There's bees everywhere. They have these round cells. But that's what a bumblebee nest looks like in whatever place it's found. And then when you think about the life cycle of a bumblebee, you have to really think about the nest cycle. An individual bumblebee, most of the workers will live only a couple weeks, maybe a month. Males will live only a couple of weeks. The only one that has a whole 1 year lifespan is a queen. But the nest itself has a 1 year lifespan, a 1 year and annual nest cycle. So we'll talk through that. And starting with like right now, it's winter. Where are the bumblebees? Bumblebee queens hibernate through the winter. So right now, underneath leaf litter, possibly a few inches deep in a compost pile or loose bare soil, there are bumblebee queens just in hibernation. They're not within a nest. They're not part of a colony. They're just individual queens. And she's really on her own. She's the only one left from her colony from last summer. When temperatures get warm enough, those independent solitary queens will emerge and they'll immediately start foraging. They need that nectar for energy. They need to feed on pollen for the protein and the other nutrients, and that helps her ovaries finish development. And once she has that energy and she's ready to go, she's going to start flying real low to the ground, usually looking for a place to form a nest. So in the early spring, you can see these very large bumblebee queens on flowers, and then sometimes you just see them, they look just like they're randomly meandering. Maybe you'll see them go into a small hole and then come out, or you'll see them go into a hollow log and come out. She's looking for a place to build her nest. Once she has found that place, she will establish the nest. And the first thing that solitary queen does is she builds little cells out of wax. She can excrete wax just like honeybees can, and she'll build a little honey pot, and she'll fill that with nectar for herself. And then she'll fill another wax cell, and she'll build these other wax cells and then provision them with pollen and nectar and lay eggs on them. And then she's going to incubate them just like a bird does. She has to keep them warm. It's usually in early spring or even maybe a little bit late spring. So she keeps them warm while they go through that egg to larva to adult transformation. So she just is there. She's drinking out of this honey pot she created for herself. That's how she's surviving and just waiting for her first daughters to emerge. Once that first generation of workers emerge, they take over all of the duties of foraging for pollen and nectar, taking care of the nest, building cells, all of that. The queen's sole responsibility at that point is laying eggs. She's the only reproductive member of this colony at this point. She's the only one that can lay eggs, the only one that can lay fertilized eggs. And so that is her job. As you get into late summer and fall, the colony reaches its peak of population, and then there when it depends on the species, it depends on the resources available, it depends on temperature, all these different things. But at some point in the late summer, early fall, the production in that nest is going to shift to reproductives. So instead of producing more generations of female workers that are just provisioning the nest, what's going to emerge from that nest are next year's queens and males. And the queens will go out and forage for nectar and pollen. The males will go out and feed on nectar and pollen. They will mate. After mating, the males will die. All of the workers will die. The foundress queen will die. That whole colony will be ended. And the only one that survives through the winter, into the winter, are the queens that were newly emerged out of that colony at the end of the summer. And then the whole cycle starts again. What I just described is typical of most bumblebees, but there is a subgroup, a subgenus. The subgenus is called Xerces, and these are cuckoo bumblebees. If you know cuckoo birds, then you maybe have an idea of what happens here, but these are social parasites. So these species of bumblebees they'll emerge from hibernation a little bit later in the season. They're going to emerge and show up on the landscape once nests are established by other species. And then what happens is this queen is going to enter that nest, and she's going to usurp the nest. She's going to take it over, usually by killing the queen and then somehow tricking the workers to turn this into her colony. So that cuckoo bee is going to be laying her eggs, and the workers of the host are going to be doing all of the work to provision and care for them. So with cuckoo bumblebees, there is no workers. There are only queens and males in the cuckoo bumblebee subgenus. If you see a cuckoo bumblebee, you usually can tell like there's something different with that bumblebee. Around here in our area, a lot of our bumblebees are different combinations of yellow and orange. Our cuckoo bumblebees have a lot more black on them. They're not the only ones, but that's one thing that you'll notice is like, oh, that something looks a little bit different. The queens are pretty big, and they are out on the landscape at the time when most of the other colonies have only workers out on the landscape, so she kind of stands out. And then they have thick heads and big mandibles that kind of makes them sort of like built for battle, right? Because they have to go in and take over that nest. They have an extra thick exoskeleton because when they try to take over the nest, it's not like the colony is going to go easily. Sometimes she gets attacked and the workers or the original queen will try stinging her to protect themselves, or they throw honey called honey daubing. They like regurgitate nectar at her to try to get her to stop invading their nest. Um, they'll have really strong stingers because they use their stinger to sting the host queen to death. And then another thing that's really that helps us to know that we're looking at a cuckoo bumblebee if it's a female is she doesn't have a pollen basket. So on the back leg of bumblebees, most of the time this is concave, and that's where they pack that ball of pollen and nectar. And cuckoo queens don't have that. It's convex. It's kind of hairy because she's never going to go out and collect pollen. She's going to rely on the host workers to do that for her. Within Colorado, we have 4 different species of cuckoo bumblebees that are known to be here. Of these, if you see a cuckoo bumblebee, it's almost always going to be this indiscriminate cuckoo bumblebee. The fernald cuckoo bumblebee is kind of rare. We don't know a ton about it. And both Suckleys and the variable cuckoo bumblebee, their populations are in steep decline. And so they haven't been seen in Colorado. I don't remember the exact, but like maybe the 2014 or 2015, like they haven't been seen in Colorado in a long time, even though they historically have been here. These cuckoo bumblebees can be host specific. So the Suckley cuckoo bumblebee is known to mostly infest nests of the Western bumblebee or American bumblebee. And that's the same with the variable cuckoo bumblebee. So they can be host specific, but again, there's a lot that we don't know about these relationships. Bumblebee nests are hard to find, and one that has a cuckoo in it is even more difficult to find. So other things that make bumblebees unique besides that life cycle, which is pretty unique in the bee world, is their ability to thermoregulate. Bees are insects, and insects are not, they're supposed to be like quote unquote cold-blooded, which means they shouldn't be able to like manage their own body temperature, but bumblebees can. They have these really big, solid flight muscles in their thorax, and they can use those flight muscles to shiver, and their shivering can help them warm up so they can fly when the temperatures are pretty cold. They have been seen flying in snow and rain, and this is why they can be seen at really high altitudes and high latitudes. There's some species of bumblebees that are known only from the Arctic Circle. And so these are cold weather insects and they're able to live in these places because of this ability to thermoregulate. If I were to go out to look for bumblebees, it's not going to be easy to find them when it's cold and snowing and raining because that's not what they prefer. If they get caught out in those conditions, they can survive, but they would prefer to be in the nice warm nest if the conditions are like that. Another thing that's really unique about them is what has been discovered about their learning and their social learning. So there are some researchers that have spent time trying to get bumblebees to solve puzzles for nectar rewards. And what they've discovered is that bumblebees can solve puzzles. They can manipulate, some researchers got them to push they look like little golf balls into a target, into a hole in order to get a nectar reward. In this picture, it's a two-part puzzle. So they have to push these two paddles in order to move the wheels to expose the nectar reward. And what they discovered is that bumblebees can figure out these puzzles, but they will learn it faster if they watch another bee solve it. And so researchers were able to teach a bee how to solve this puzzle by having a little fake puppet bee solve the puzzle. And then other bees are able to solve the puzzle if they watch their sisters do this. And if you think about it in nature, that makes sense that bumblebees have to be able to learn. The individuals from that colony are foraging all through the year, from spring, early summer, late summer, fall. The flowers are changing all throughout that time. And so they have to learn how to find flowers and how to get the resources that they need out of all different kinds of flowers. And so they have to be able to adapt and learn. And it's going to be way more efficient for the colony if they can kind of show each other how to do this. So it's super fascinating. And I think it'd be really fun to be in that lab and watch bumblebees solve puzzles. Another thing that makes bumblebees really important when it comes to pollination is their ability to buzz pollinate, often called sonication. This is something that honeybees cannot do, but some other native bees can. This happens in certain types of flowers that have the pollen deep inside poricidal anthers, so it's not easy to get the pollen out. In fact, for the pollen to come out, that flower needs to get rattled. It needs to get vibrated. And so the bumblebee, you can see here in this little video that's playing, is she'll land on the flower and she'll grip it with her legs, and she'll also hang on with her mandibles, her mouth parts. And then she'll vibrate her thoracic flight muscles. The same thing as like shivering. So basically she's shivering on that flower, and you can hear it happening. It's kind of a high-pitched kind of sound. And by doing that, you can see the pollen come shooting out of that poricidal anther there, that they have learned that you have to sonicate certain types of flowers, and then all of that pollen lands on the hairs. So she's gathering it, and then she'll usually fly to another flower and kind of groom it and pack it onto her pollen package right there on her leg. So this is really important for things like tomatoes and blueberries. Some plants don't have to be sonicated, but their fruit will set better. They'll have better harvest if they do get buzz pollinated. So that's something that bumblebees are important for. So those are all the things that make them awesome and amazing and unique. So now we need to talk about some concerns that we have about bumblebees and their conservation. This graph This circle graph comes from the IUCN Red List website, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this circle represents all North American bumblebee species, and they have 46 on their list. And the different colors represent their category, their status of like, are they doing okay or are they not doing okay? The good news is this green. Green means least concern. So of our 46 species that are classified here, 25 of those species are of least concern. They're doing fine, and in some cases, their ranges are expanding. What's pretty concerning is this red and this orange and this yellow. So the red is critical. We have 4 North American species that are critically endangered. Some, like I've said, that haven't been seen in years. 2 species of North American bumblebees are considered endangered. 13% or 6 of them are considered vulnerable. And then you have this big chunk that are data deficient. These are ones that we don't know. Maybe they're of least concern. Maybe they're in one of these concern categories. But these are things that are just, their populations were really small to begin with, or they could be some of those high altitude or Arctic bumblebees that people just haven't had a chance to study really well. So from this, we know that 25% of North American bumblebees are at some level of risk. In Colorado, it's the same percentage. 6 of our species fall into one of those categories. So we have the Western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus, and the Morrison bumblebee, Bombus morrisoni. These 3 are in that vulnerable category. The Southern Plains bumblebee, Bombus fraternus, is one that in Colorado you would only find over on the eastern side of the state, is in that endangered category. And these 2, you can tell from their pictures that they must not be very common because the only pictures I could find of them are museum specimens when they're on pins, because they're just not seen in nature. Those are both cuckoo species, and they are both considered critically endangered. And what's interesting and sort of makes sense is these 2 cuckoo bumblebee species, their primary hosts, or at least the hosts that we know about, are Bombus occidentalis and Bombus pennsylvanicus. So these are their primary hosts. So their ranges and populations have declined. So it makes sense that the cuckoo bumblebees are in that critically endangered place because they don't have their hosts. Their hosts are declining. So this decline comes from a lot of different factors. So the things that are threatening bumblebees, and this is true like of all of our native bees, all of these threats that are affecting bumblebees are affecting all other native bees as well. So number 1 is habitat loss and fragmentation. Bumblebees need flowers. That is their only food source. They need places to nest, and they need places to overwinter. And if you think about most of our landscapes, think about cities, streets, roads, highways. Think about suburbs with nice green lawns that are perfectly manicured. Think about agricultural settings. There's just not flowers there. There's not a lot of rodent holes or piles of sticks or rocks or just loose bare soil that's there for them to forage in or to nest in. And then even if there are patches of flowers available for them, there's this fragmentation, which prevents bumblebee colonies from interacting with each other and mating with each other, so we don't get the genetic diversity that is needed for colony health. Another threat is pathogens from commercial bees. All animals have pathogens that can cause them to get sick. And some of those pathogens have been shown to come from honeybee hives. So honeybee hives are like the first commercial bee that I think of. And there are some pathogens that have spilled over from honeybee hives. But what some researchers believe that some of these declines started from commercial bumblebee hives. The eastern bumblebee is one that has been reared commercially and still is, and has gotten shipped all over the US. It's unregulated in most states. And so these bumblebees that are raised in a commercial, raised in like a warehouse setting and sent out all across the US, they have been shown to spread pathogens into wild bee populations. Pesticides are another threat. There's a lot of chemicals that get sprayed onto the landscape, from herbicides and fungicides to insecticides. And even if, like any insecticide, kills all insects, so bees are going to definitely be in danger from that. But even things that are just targeting plants, remember plants are the food for bees. And so that definitely is going to affect them, even if it doesn't hit them directly. Their food can get contaminated with those chemicals. Well, honeybees are important for agriculture. They make honey, which we love. Honeybee hives can have huge populations at the height of summer, and there is evidence that especially when there's very few resources available on a landscape, native bees can get outcompeted by honeybee hives because they have such vast numbers and they're really good foragers. And climate change is another one. I'm thinking about bees need flowers. So if there's really high temperatures that scorch the plants, if there's drought so the plants can't survive, that's going to affect bumblebees. Bumblebees are more of those cold weather species, so we're not really sure what's going to happen to these colonies as temperatures rise. And then thinking about fires and floods and all of those other things, this is something that we're watching in real time. It's definitely affecting them, but we just don't know the extent. And with all of these threats, they might be able to fight against one of them, but all of these threats are like interconnected. So all of these things together kind of exacerbate each one. And so all of them together are causing these declines in bumblebee populations and other native bee populations as well. So the good news, like that's like bummer. That's like really sad news. If we love bees and we know their importance, it's sad to hear about these declines. And it's frustrating to hear about the human causes of them. But the good news is that everybody can help with this. There's really simple things that anybody can do. Number one is habitat. Planting flowers so that there's always flowers available on the landscape. For a bumblebee colony, that queen, when she comes out of hibernation, she needs floral resources right away in the early spring. And then members of that colony are out foraging all through the summer until the late fall, when it's really important for there to be good flowers because next year's queens are building up their fat reserves before they hibernate. We can all provide habitat for nesting and overwintering, which means just having a little bit of part of a garden or yard or space that's a little bit messy, where there's rock piles or stick piles or leaf litter or just any kinds of things that could provide that safe place for them to nest and overwinter. Really thinking about if and when to use pesticides to hopefully remove a lot of those chemicals from their landscape. And then a number one thing that everybody can do is just tell other people. Tell people what they can do, the importance of flowers and less pesticides. There are a ton of resources out to help with this. The Xerces Society that I work for is really great about this. They have blogs and videos and a podcast and social media and just tons of fact sheets and different things on the website. The Xerces Society has also published a whole bunch of different books that you can get. And there's also a ton of local resources from Native Plant Society and gardening clubs and native plant nurseries that can help build this habitat that all bumblebees need. But then we can also help bumblebees on a larger scale, and this is now shifting into the idea of the Bumblebee Atlas. And this is if we think about conservation, and if we want to think about what lands do we want to protect and conserve, which plants should we be using for habitat restoration efforts, before we can really know that or take those actions and know that they're going to hopefully be helpful, before we can help those bumblebees, we need to know where they are and what habitats and flowers they need. And that's just information that we don't have consistently across the US. So that's the purpose of the Bumblebee Atlas that I'm in charge of. The Mountain States Bumblebee Atlas is a community science project, and our goals are to find, photograph, and map our native bumblebee species. The Mountain States project covers the states of Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada, and we launched last June, and we are looking forward to the 2025 field season and the next couple of years ahead. And this is something that is supported by the Bureau of Land Management and Colorado Parks and Wildlife, working together with Xerces. This map is showing what we knew about where bumblebees are before the project started. So this comes from a Bumblebees of North America database that a coworker of mine manages. And each of these dots is a bumblebee record since the year 2000. Some of these are from scientific research. Some of these are from museum collections. A lot of them are iNaturalist observations, which is why it looks like bumblebees love the cities. So what that is telling us is we like there's a lot of incidental observations, but we have not evenly surveyed and looked for bumblebees across these 4 states. There's a lot of big gaps to fill of understanding in the wild. Where are our bumblebees found and what habitats are they using and what resources are they relying on? Yeah, so I just kind of said that. These are our questions. Where are they? What habitats are they using? What flowers are they relying on? And the goal is just to gather information so we can help land managers make good conservation decisions. What lands to protect, what plants to use for restoration. This is community science, so we want anyone and everyone who's interested to join. And the process is easy, requires little training, but you would adopt a grid cell. You get to go out and survey for bumblebees, which is fun and some people say sort of addicting. And then you submit your data online. We do have a standardized protocol, so you have to follow the same process. And this is so that we can compare observations across the whole region and across all the other states where this is happening. So there is training that's required, and there's lots of ways to get trained. The 2025 handbook is having final edits happening now, and it should be posted on the website by the beginning of February. We have training videos, we have website content, in-person workshops and field trainings to help people get trained. And then you adopt a grid cell. So our 4-state region has been divided into 371 grid cells that are 50 by 50 kilometers. And when you adopt a grid cell, you're going to say, I'm going to go to that grid cell twice during the field season and do 2 bumblebee surveys. And that's what we asked of you. That's what adopting a grid cell means. When you go out to do your surveys, these are non-lethal, so you don't have to kill and pin any bumblebees. We teach our volunteers to go out with a net and catch them, put them carefully and safely into a vial. You put them on ice, and the ice doesn't hurt them, but it chills them and immobilizes them. So you have a nice immobilized bee that you can take pictures from all different angles, which allows us to be able to identify them to species from photos. All of the pictures and data get uploaded to bumblebeewatch.org. This is a screenshot of what that looks like. And then once they're there, on the back end, my job is to look at all of those pictures and identify them to species. And then you can go on Bumblebee Watch and you can look at where have different species been observed. And then as your species get identified by experts, you can track which species you've seen and observed. We launched last year in June, like I mentioned, and here the blue stars are places where surveys were done and bees were found. The black squares are where surveys were done and no bees were found. So we had 177 surveys done, and through that we had over 800 bumblebee observations, and we have detected 21 species there. You can see there's still a lot of gaps to fill. Our goal is to have 2 surveys in every one of those grid cells before the end of the project. And what's awesome is that this is part of a bigger initiative. The Xerces Society last summer had 20 different states with bumblebee atlases going on. The first atlas started in 2018, and then the mountain states and Montana just started last year. And so we have years of bumblebee observations, and you can see the states where we have them. And what's amazing then is we can look on these larger regional scales and learn about where are there pockets of maybe these endangered or threatened species where they're doing okay. What can we see about their ranges compared to their historical ranges? And when we all use the same protocols on this large scale, it makes us able to see the big picture of bumblebee population health in the US. So this is really fun interactive dashboard that if you go to the Bumblebee Atlas website, you can actually click on states and you can click on years, you can click on species, and it all like the dots change and the graphs change and you can see all that has been done since the first Atlas project launched in 2018. So I invite you to think about joining the Atlas if you're interested or telling someone you know who might be interested. It's a little early, it's January, the queens are still sleeping, but it's coming up soon. And so just thinking about if you're interested, knowing that there's virtual training webinars that are happening on March 11th and April 23rd. Those are the same thing. And then we're planning some outdoor in-person training events in April and May. So I'm excited about that. And you can always go to the website to explore bumblebeeatlas.org. This QR code will take you there. And another good thing to do is there's an interest form that's there. If you fill in your information, you can join our e-newsletter mailing list, and then you'll learn about when the field season starts, where trainings are, and all of that. So I encourage you to check it out.
Thank you so much, Amy. To speak to that training opportunity specifically, so as Amy mentioned, there is an April date that the BLM is hosting, but there's also a date in May, Wednesday the 28th, and that's going to be led through West Slope Outdoor Volunteers. So if the idea of going and catching bumblebees and putting them into little vials and on ice makes you a little nervous, or if you just want to learn by doing, I'm going to include an interest form in the email that I send out tomorrow with the recording. And that will be for anyone on this call or anyone who volunteers with any of the organizations that are a part of West Slope Outdoor Volunteers to kind of tentatively sign up for that event in May, which we are still kind of figuring out the details for. But if you get on that list now, you can kind of be kept in the loop as we figure those details out. We do have a few questions that came in already, so everyone feel free to use the Q&A to submit any additional questions you have. But Amy, starting out, this one came in when you were showing the bee life cycle, the bumblebee life cycle. Mary asks, where are the males and what are they doing?
Yeah, there are no males for most of the season. The males come out of the nest just at the very end of the colony cycle, late summer, early fall, and they are out on the landscape for a couple weeks maybe. There is some evidence that while they're still in the nest that they can help with thermal regulation. But usually when they leave the nest, they stay out. They don't come back and sleep in the nest with all the females. And they feed, they nap in flowers, and their job is mating. They're reproductives.
Great. Here's another question. How far does an average bumblebee forage in a day?
Yeah, they have been shown to fly pretty far, like even up to, I want to say, half a mile or even sometimes further in extreme situations. They will forage as close to the nest as possible, just mostly from an energy standpoint. It takes a lot of energy resources to fly. And so if they're foraging close to the nest, that's going to be best for them. So a lot of times when you see a lot of bumblebees in an area, especially if they're the same species, there's probably a nest nearby.
Great. Cedar had another question, which is for those of us, especially in this area, I think it's growing increasingly popular to xeriscape our lawns for water conservation. But when you have no trees or grass or flowers and those kind of materials, what can we do in our homes or neighborhoods that have that xeriscaping, such as, overturning a pot? Could that be a winter habitat for those bumblebees? Or what would you suggest in that type of landscaping?
It's interesting, and it's a question that I have too about like some of these desert environments is like what do bees do in the wild? I did most of my learning about bumblebees in Montana and Idaho, and so some of this is a little bit interesting to me. But they do like overwintering, they need loose soil or leaf litter or something like that. So possibly having some bare soil there for overwintering. Nesting, it's just again like they can nest in rock piles or in other like small plants. Sometimes they're just underneath the base of some of those plants. But yeah, like that's an interesting question. And as I advocate for the xeriscaping because of the water needs, but bees need flowers. So finding something that can flower and then just knowing that those habitats are then, yeah, being creative. I don't know, like they might nest under a pot. There are, like you can buy bumblebee nest houses, but they typically don't use them. Though they have been known to build nests in birdhouses sometimes.
Hmm.
So they'll use what they can find if it's available and feels safe to them.
Yeah, I was just seeing some resources about doing sustainable landscape design and more, native species and water conscious practices. And there was a guide I found to building a crevice garden, I think they called it, which is burying rocks of different sizes. And you can make it a really beautiful feature in your yard, but that also might be able to kind of provide some of that loose soil and nesting space. If I can find that, I will include that in the email tomorrow as well. And Amy, any of these resources that you'd like to share, send them my way, and those can go out in that big batch email to everyone who's registered. And that'll include the recording and any other resources that we're talking about.
Sounds good.
Yeah, we have one other question. Going back to the cuckoo bumblebee, what are the pros and cons of that, cuckoo bumblebee? If they are in decline, is that something the scientific community is worried about?
Um, yes, like we're concerned. It makes sense that they're the first ones to have to be threatened on a landscape because they are like these social parasites. Some people hear the story of the cuckoo bees and they're like, oh, so they're the bad guys, so we don't care about them. But a lot of researchers kind of see them almost as like like an indicator. If you're seeing a lot of cuckoos on the landscape, then you know that they're finding host nests, and so then there must be an okay bumblebee population. And even though like the cuckoo queen is not out doing foraging, they're still contributing to, the nests and the pollination that's happening. So yes, we are concerned. A lot of our cuckoo bumblebee species are the ones that are at risk. And a lot of that, just thinking about that indicator piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Um, I guess somebody added a comment that the Discovery Garden at Central Library here in Grand Junction does have a crevice garden in one section. So if anyone in Grand Junction wants to scope it out for their yard, Cedar, that's a good tip. Thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
and Discovery Garden had a ton of bumblebees. I went there with some of the Fish and Wildlife Service biologists at the end of
nice.
last year to practice the survey techniques, and there was a lot of bumblebees in that garden.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Well, we are at 6:30, and I don't think I've seen any new questions come in. So, Amy, thank you so much for the time and that fascinating presentation. I loved the part about the fake puppet bees teaching problem solving. I would love to be in that lab too. Um, so with that, everyone, we do have one more lecture next week, and that's going to be a sweeping career in public lands management with Ed Franz. Otherwise, Amy, thank you so much for your time tonight, and everyone keep an eye out for that email with resources and this recording tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.